Cool. Well, hey, welcome everybody. This is the Community Rights US Book Club. We're excited to share some really innovative and inspiring ideas about the community rights movement, which is a local democracy movement and rights of nature and and things of that nature. So right now we're reading a book called Defying Corporations, Defining Democracy. It's a collection of essays by the original members of POCLAD, the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, who really began formulating some of these ideas in the 90s. I'm looking at this first essay that we had this week. It's called We the People, Building a Truly Democratic Society by Ward Morehouse. That's page 211 for those of you who have the book. And I thought it was interesting because he makes multiple references to this book called Ishmael, which is a book that I read years and years and years ago. So I don't really remember it actually. Honestly, I can't quite remember the details, but I remember really liking it a lot and being really affected. It's basically a story of a young person who gets this sort of tutelage in like ancient wisdom from an orangutan who like can somehow speak telepathically and gives this non-human perspective that really like is very transformative of our world. And then Ward Morehouse is comparing that to the type of transformative worldview change that is a part of like moving into this community rights paradigm, where we no longer are putting up with the abuses of these corporate overlords. There's a lot of stuff in here, that says like the bars to our cage are our colonized minds that have led us to surrender our sovereignty to giant corporations increasingly dominate our society, not to mention the rest of the world. And also I noticed one thing that jumped out at me when I read this is that he includes some statistics about like wealth inequality, and they're from like the 80s and 90s, and they seem like such small numbers compared to what it is now. Like what they were talking about as being like obscenely unequal in the 80s and 90s is like dwarfed by the like extreme, wealth disparity now. And as I just sort of like flip through this, I see a lot more quotes from the book Ishmael, and I see a lot of references to the specific court cases. I think, I'm just sort of skimming through this at this point, and hoping other folks will jump in, but I really like this first essay. I marked it as one that, I want to come back to really inform the way that I talk about what we're doing in the community rights movement, because it's pretty short and it's pretty compelling. And a little different, with these references to this novel and stuff like that. I think it's a pretty interesting one. Did anyone have any like stuff that jumped them out of this essay?
Yeah, I actually really like this essay too. I think it was one of my favorites, and something that I really liked. Well, there's a couple things, but one point which I don't really remember being made as much or as clearly in the other essays is that it's not enough if we want to practice real democracy, radical democracy. It's not enough to rely on creating an institution, or as well-meaning as that institution might be, that is supposed to help us exercise democracy in society. And on page 213, on the bottom left column, he says, we design institutions, loom states, hoping that they will bring about or preserve a certain kind and state of being. Sometimes they do and sometimes they do not. And sometimes that state of being may appear without the support of any institutions. The same uncertainty of cause and effect is certainly true of democracy. All the institutions asserted to achieve democracy may be created and yet still not achieve it. It is also true that all the institutions designed to suppress it may be established and democracy may break out before our very eyes. So I thought that was really good because, you know, we, a lot of this book that, not just this book, but, you know, when we have conversations amongst us, like we talk about kind of how is democracy repressed systemically, and we focus a lot on the institutional repression. And in this case, he's saying, you know, we have to kind of focus on the how to be democratic, the state of being of democracy. And then the second point that I really like, which is immediately following that one, is that as he says, the essence of democracy is politics, the arts of the possible. And of course, like me as an artist, was super thrilled to see him mention art, right? Because like most of this book, there's no mention of art, and art is a way of doing something, and it's the quality. It's not as focused as this sort of like our very our Western civilization is really focused on quantity, and art is really about quality. I mean, this is of course like just totally overgeneralizing everything, but and I think that's really key, you know. The cultural shift, yes, but what is culture without art? And not art in the specific sense of like, you know, like okay, just, you know, the paintings that we see in a museum. I'm not really getting that specific, but art is the art of doing something. And then he goes on to say that democracy is a performance art, like music, dance, and theater. We can construct theaters and assemble troops of dancers and musicians, but the art exists only while it is being performed. So it is with democracy. That's beautiful. And it's like, I think it's just a really great analogy because it's so true. I mean, during the pandemic, you know, a lot of us now, like getting into a more specific analogy, but I think it still holds, you know, concerts and any type of like live art really suffered because even though a lot of the stuff was streamed, a lot of people just remarked that it was like a completely different phenomenon. You know, you're not experiencing what that thing is designed to provide to you. You're not, there's so much that goes on in that live setting that is not translated remotely. And that's just like a little detailed kind of analogy, but I think it's really a helpful mindset that there's something lost in translation when we try to funnel democracy through institutions and forget that it's something that has to be lived artfully.
That was very good. Thank you for that.
That just kicks off something Paul said in a video a long time back that caused me to go, wait, wow, you know, I hadn't thought of that. And it was that we don't just, democracy and law is actually creative. It's hard to believe it. We were so involved in defining what we didn't want, you know, outlawing this or outlawing that. And it hadn't occurred to me that maybe we should define what we want. You know, and that like opened up a whole nother door because I'd always thought of laws as being, you know, restricting and telling people what they should and shouldn't do. And then I realized, wow, you know, there's a whole another universe there if you start thinking about what you want and defining that instead of defining, you know, restricting corporations or regulating. And I'm open now to there's probably 4 or 5 or 1,000 more doors that I haven't even heard of yet or haven't thought of yet. But it's I know a little bit in legislation. You can be very creative. Instead of outlawing what you don't want, you can create incentives for what you do.
Or require. You could require things too, which maybe isn't very democratic. I don't know. It's a question.
I'm noticing a quote in here, and I wonder what you all think of this. This quote from someone named Grider. The search for democratic meaning is necessarily a path of hard conflict, but the distant horizon is reconciliation. Americans coming to terms with themselves, that is the high purpose our politics was meant to serve.
Where's that quote, Tyler?
It's right at the end. It's in the third to last paragraph on page 216.
Thank you. It's kind of interesting to contrast the distant horizon as reconciliation with King's the arc of the universe is long, but it ends towards justice.
Yeah, I thought reconciliation was a weird word. I couldn't really understand what he's getting at actually by recording that.
Do you think he means compromise? Like that's maybe the word that's more commonly used in that sort of context?
Oh, but even compromise would seem off. Yeah.
I think there's this element in the language that he uses, there's this element of like transformative understanding. And I think, I think that's why he uses the word reconciliation, because it's not about coming to agreement, it's about going beyond the conflict. And exactly what that is, hard to say, right? especially when it's something projected into the future. But I thought it was an interesting idea, and I'm not exactly sure what I think about it. I have a lot of thoughts about it, but
it's a fascinating quote. I mean, Americans coming to terms with themselves. I mean, just that alone, it's like,
right? It's got like a spiritual transcendent quality to it, right? And he does, let's see. I was trying to find something else, but maybe memory a little fuzzy on what it was exactly. Yeah, here. So someone named Loomis, in his seminal book, Radical Democracy, argues that democracy is more than a set of institutions or a system. It is rather a state of being, right? That's pretty like, meta level kind of talk, right?
Yeah, it's Lummis, Douglas Lummis.
Oh, okay.
And he wrote Radical Democracy, which Karen Coulter, one of the original POCLAD 12, brought to the attention of the other 11 and said, you all have to see this book, Radical Democracy. I just discovered it. It blows my mind. Democracy as art and culture, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, and so I added it to the collection of books that are considered core CR books.
Yeah, it sounds like we should be reading that book.
Yeah, I was thinking that might be a good one for next. It's definitely one of them, yeah. But yeah, if anyone wants, I mean, I have copies. Anyway. But yeah, and he's Lummis is an American who spent most of his life living in Japan. So he's writing about the US democracy to a large degree from Japan.
Interesting. Anyone else have thoughts on this essay? We have two others that we can look at as well.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to comment on how the essay transitions, because a very common form that we've seen in these essays is that begins pretty visionary, and then in the end, they try to conclude with something that will give us like a silver lining as to what would be like our ticket out of the situation. Not that there's one ticket, but that there's some ideas that we can entertain. And I was just kind of wondering what you guys thought about how this particular essay transitioned from the visionary piece to some more practical piece, because 214 is when that transition starts, and it begins with promoting the idea of the democratic conversation. And at first, when I read that, I had to kind of like repress any sort of, or not totally repress, but just put aside for a minute, defer like whatever inhibitions I had when reading that. And he does mention that, okay, yes, you know, it's a bit, maybe a bit cliche to say that, and it's just a starting point. And of course, we're not going to be just sitting around the table talking about the problem forever, but it is, he does emphasize that it's a beginning point, which, you know, I kind of question myself throughout thinking, okay, was it important to emphasize that point? But that's what he does. And then he goes on to, when he tries to come up with ideas of practical ways that we can start chipping at corporate control, he focuses on election campaign finance reform. And so I was wondering what you guys thought about that, because that's pretty much where it ended.
So it goes from really cosmic, almost spiritual, to these very conventional solutions.
Election campaign finance reform, yeah, right.
For
So,
me, on the practical side, it seems like I was living in a bubble for so long and had never known there were alternatives to this kind of life, this way of thinking, and starting to see how other countries do things, how other people solve what a co-op is. You know, there's so few of them here that, to me, the solution or the step towards transformation is just being exposed to these things that seem to be stripped out of our society. I mean, just wiped out of our society, so we've never seen them, and we've never thought of them, and so we don't even know what direction, you know. And there's so many things, so many solutions out there that other people have done, but I had never heard of them in school. You know, I never heard of them in on TV, the media, you know, people I know. So and we need to see better solutions in action, and I think that really gives us that's transformation for me. That starts my mind going in the direction that it should go for health and prosperity, real prosperity.
well, I also don't want to discount the power of election campaign finance reform. I mean, yeah, what would it be enough? I guess, okay, so the question is, now, you know, how many, I don't know, 20 years after the book was written or something like that, would that have been enough if we actually had successfully, if we had a successful election campaign finance reform in place? And then follow up, Paul, why wouldn't have it been enough?
I mean, 20 years ago, it was already a disaster. Yeah.
But okay, assuming that there was actually a powerful reform put in place, why wouldn't that have been enough to allow the emergence or the development of real democracy from the ground up?
Anybody else want to take this? Well, I mean, the obvious thing that pops into my mind initially is because it's not about money. It's not about regulating money. I mean, that's just like, what, 2% of what a healthy democracy is about? It shrinks it so much. And I want to take it a little further, what I kind of jumping off of also what Don just said. The very final paragraph of the article: this insurgency will not begin with abstract ideas or charismatic political leaders. Its origins will lie among ordinary people who have the will to engage themselves with their surrounding reality. But ordinary people who have the will to engage themselves with surrounding reality, as Don just pointed out, are unlikely to get outside of the bubble without really significant assistance from outside the bubble. So it's, in a way, this author is doing a huge disservice, you know, going from Lummis's, you know, extraordinary language to let's just pass a few laws. And it does a real disservice to the idea that common people can engage themselves and figure this stuff out. I think.
Right. So part of the,
Yeah,
the
I
reason
think,
why, go ahead.
well, I think that's legit criticism, but also I think we should probably give him a break because if you notice, this was like a UU church sermon in 1997. Probably campaign finance reform was like the topic of the day, is
Oh.
probably the reason that it's in there. You know?
Okay.
I mean, and it sounds like a sermon, doesn't it? I mean, this really reads like this sort of, you know, democracy as spiritual practice is most of it. And then there's this weird part about campaign finance reform that you could easily just cut it out and it would be fine without it, right?
Yeah,
Good.
you totally could. I mean, I think the deflating thing about that Paul is kind of touching on is that, well, not touching on, but that you already said it, is like even with a successful campaign finance reform, okay, what's the best that could happen? That somehow, in the most extreme case, you are limiting or you're completely preventing politicians from being funded by corporations or being supported financially by corporations in any way, shape, or form. That would be an extreme case that no reform that we could ever think of would accomplish. But let's say that it did accomplish that. Okay, so now politicians are not being supported by corporate finance whatsoever. We're still living in a corporate culture that everything relies on corporations for generating money, and somewhere or another, indirectly, they will be supported by corporations. That's one point. But another point is that even in that most ideal scenario, we're still relying on someone else, you know, to represent us. And I guess this kind of goes to this like archetypal sort of distinguishment between representation and direct democracy. But is that something that we would be okay with? And the problem of relying on politicians to represent us is, of course, eventually, especially when they're not people of our town, people of our city, people who wrestle and live with the things that we live with, is that it's not going to be really true representation. So anyways, that might be extending it a little too far, but I think that it does, if you extend it far enough, that's pretty much where you get to, is that point.
I'm okay with politicians representing me if I know exactly what they're doing every minute of the day, where they're at, where they're who they're talking to, and what they're getting as far as, you know, financing or whatever from other. But the transparency part is really hard to find around here.
Yeah, but I think that one of the most powerful things about community rights work is precisely that it relies on residents being concerned with something that's happening to them. It's like a collective shared concern over their livelihood. So I wonder, I mean, this is sort of like, yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, Donna. Okay, it's like, well, why wouldn't you be okay with representation as long as you know what they're doing? And I guess for me, there would always be this concern that, well, why would they care as much as, would they ever be able to care as much as the stakeholders in the place that they live, like our neighbors, you know, would they ever be able to care as much as our neighbors? So yeah, anyways, I don't want to go down that, it's not a rabbit hole, whatever it is. I don't want to go down it because it would be a whole like other philosophical conversation.
Anything else folks want to touch on from that essay, or should we go to the next one with the rest of our time? We
might as well go to the next one.
We have two letters here. One is to Akil Reed Amar from Yale Law School, and it's a reply to a book. And the other one is a letter to the Alliance for Democracy. Both are interesting. They're short.
Would someone who has read either want to like read a piece that was especially provocative from either one?
I like the one by Mike Ferner, I believe it's pronounced.
Turner? Mhm.
And if I were to just give somebody a chapter or one thing to read, that would be one of them. You know, because it really kind of encapsulates a lot, and there's a lot to think about there. I think all of these essays in the book are really pushing people to think past their cages, and you know, our colonized minds, and saying, hey, you know, there's outside the cage, there's something about, there's really some really nice things, and you know, have you even thought of them? And it's like a lot of these letters to these people that that never occurred to them. They're reminded. I mean, but it's a very necessary thing, service that these letters are performing by telling people, but pointing out to people that there's far more than they imagined, I guess you could say.
Yeah. He sure hits a lot of the key points, you know, in what Poclad and Seldef, you know, what the work is about. The core principles, the core aha moments.
Okay, I want to read a couple of paragraphs that I think are really relevant to our work as educators and sort of, you know, proselytizers of this, you know, idea of community rights, because it points at some of the tensions in the sort of American democratic experiment. So I'm looking on page 221 on the right side. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs about okay, I'll start here. True, the founding fathers left out the majority of human inhabitants in their "we the people." This is not to say, however, that they didn't believe their own rhetoric in the Declaration, Constitution, Preamble, and so forth. But because they defined most of the humans in the 13 colonies as property or non-persons, whole classes of people had to struggle for centuries to overcome this atrocious, immoral, structural mess. That is, to define themselves and not let anyone else define them. The myth of democracy, though, can be something beyond that grossly incomplete inclusion, something on which we draw in order to proceed. One could argue that America's mythical democracy has inspired many people here and abroad to undertake amazing things. Here at home, as more people realize the inequities, political corruption, etc., one could also argue that the myth is losing its power to glue us together. One of the challenges of creating a real democratic process is grappling with the meaning and details of our myths. One myth is that of unlimited economic growth. And then he goes on from there. And what follows is a little less interesting than those couple of paragraphs, I think.
That's a good paragraph too, though, because so much of the thinking is based on an infinite Earth. I mean, that seems like when the country was founded and people were settling it, it was, you know, a big party of resources. You know, grab them and take them back to Europe, and there's no end to it. It's a huge continent, and back then, they I guess they were thinking that, you know, they would never deplete it.
It is infinite to them, yeah. What Richard Grossman calls the endless production of more.
But that's over. Even our economic theories are all really based on growth. There's very few that are based on stopping growth or you know, staying in one place. And that's one of the cages that our minds are in. I mean, we're born thinking that there's really no end. It's, you know, just go out there and grab and get it, you know. you get rich or what. I mean, wow. To me, this blows my mind. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I've always really been taken by the concept of those who are in power have defining authority. And one of the most powerful things they get to do is they get to define themselves, and they get to as having power and having relevance, and they get to define all other beings as other, and then they break all those other beings down into subcategories. And it's, you know, it's a particular piece that I love teaching in my weekend trainings, because I ask students, okay, let's, how did they define all these other groups? How do they define women? And like nobody even remembers anymore. It's like property. How do they define slaves? Property. How do they define Native people? Silence. You know, long silence. They define Native people as savages, as literally just an extension of the dark, scary woods. You know, they didn't really have that kind of formal definition because they didn't actually see them as human beings. It's very interesting. And then, just defining authority. It's like, how do we, the people, claim defining authority? How do we define ourselves? How do we define leadership? How do we define action? How do we define democracy? How do we define governance? And in all the workshops that I've ever led, those are not conversations that go very far. Like, I really want, 15, 20 people sitting together for a weekend at that point to just like, I want fire to come out of their mouths, right? And I want like this juicy stuff. And most of us are just stuck at that point. And maybe it's just fear of sounding stupid. Like, I actually haven't really ever thought that much about why so much silence in those moments in a weekend workshop. But like, who wants to be the first one to say something that, might get laughed at or sound stupid to others? But that's where the creativity starts, right? It's like,
It's
who's
just
going to be
so
the first
different.
one? What?
It's just such a different idea that you're trying to put it on like a shirt or something in your mind, and you can't. There's no place for it to fit. I mean, it really is. That's what it seems like to me. It's like we don't even know how to think down that path.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think that Don is right about that. I would hasten to say that it's probably more that people are just struck by an idea that is so different that they just are having trouble wrapping their heads around it. And I mean, and so based on what you're Paul, what you're saying is that I mean, would you then agree that or are you feeling comfortable with calling what the revolutionists put forward as a myth of democracy? Because Ferner is saying that he feels like he says, I get a little ouchy when people refer to creating the myth of democracy, but I am beginning to understand what they mean. So you feel ouchy when people refer to creating the myth of democracy, or are you like, oh yeah, totally?
So I need a clarification first. So the myth of democracy, meaning the myth that we live in a democracy?
No, the myth that from the American, so this was in the section called Purpose of the American Revolution.
Okay.
And it begins with, was the point to A, get a new king, or B, replace a monarchy with a republic and create the myth of a democracy?
I see. This is
yes. So he's talking about.
I've not read the essay yet. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So do you think that the revolutionaries created the myth of a democracy? I mean, I guess, yes, technically, yes, right? But he goes on to say, my friend goes on to say, and that, interestingly, he goes on to say that this is not to say, however, that they didn't believe their own rhetoric in the Declaration, Constitution, Preamble, and so forth. So I thought that was interesting. And maybe that's part of the key too, to wrapping our head around why are we so complacent? So like, how is it, do you believe, okay, one, that they created this myth of democracy, two, that maybe they actually did believe in their own rhetoric, even though a very small percentage of people were part of this democratic experiment to begin with?
What a complex thing to ask. Well, I'll start an answer and other people should follow. Well, first, we really shouldn't treat the founding fathers as monolithic, the so-called founding fathers.
True.
Thomas Jefferson is one of the radicals among them, and they send him to Europe to be an ambassador to get him out of the way for quite a few years when they're developing. I don't even remember the period. I just remember hearing stories from Grossman about this, that he was a threat because he actually believed in representative democracy, including everybody. And so at essential moments, he needed to be not in the room for the more feudal types like Madison and Washington to get what they wanted. But I think my sense from from my historical understanding, which almost entirely comes from Poclad, is that, yeah, they did believe that they were creating a democratic society. Absolutely. You have to remember, compared to what? Compared to Britain, where they came from, where there was no democratic institutions at all. There was nothing going on that you could call democratic at all at that point. So it's a huge leap forward what they created, even though many of them, like Madison says, the purpose of government is to protect the opulent minority from the majority. The primary purpose of government. I mean, that's close to an exact quote. So, if you contrast Madison and Jefferson, I think the vast majority wanted to just create another powerful state, the vast majority of the so-called founders, that they could rule, in some semblance of democratic something. But I'll shut up and let others
Well,
answer.
I was going to ask that. Was the founding fathers, this idea of this the Constitution, all a ruse, to basically get more for themselves? They were land speculators and all, like greenwashing is today, where corporations claim they're being green, and yet we know it's just a cover. It's just good PR.
Maybe for some, not for everybody. What do
yeah.
other one, Tyler?
I mean, I don't doubt that the so-called founding fathers, genuinely believed that they, were doing something remarkable. It was just restricted to their class, very, very small group of people. Um, but it's also like the American mythology from the start is also exceedingly like influenced by the mythology of the Roman Empire, right? It was a colonial empire from the beginning. Like in the Constitution, it's clear. It's a super expansionist and all that manifest destiny stuff. So you get this sort of, I think it's eerily resembles the story of the Roman Empire, just in like a really short time period, repeating it of like start out with some sort of democracy and then it becomes really corrupted and we get this sort of generations of dictatorship until it finally goes into decline, what do you call it, decadence, and then falls apart as like everyone around them is just a little bit more up and coming, and Rome is sort of declining. And I feel like the American Empire reached its peak some time ago, and we are in decline phase right now, and that presents an entirely different set of problems than it was even as little as like 30 years ago in the 90s. We're actually in a very different place now, and on lots of different levels, and I won't go off on a million tangents, but
And when
I
empires
think it's interesting to
collapse,
consider that sort of
sorry,
go ahead.
just when empires collapse, really scary, dangerous things tend to happen. The empire tends to act in some incredible, they act out in some very dangerous and provocative and offensive ways, and we're seeing, yet another set of empires collapse, including ours.
Locally, that is, instead of in other countries like it has been. I think that's...
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the fear that I would fear is that we're going to have local, chaos. But, if you were living in South America, Central America, you would think that there was a collapse already happening, the fruit company and all that stuff. So I don't know. I got off on a tangent. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that. Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Carla.
Sorry, it's harder when you can't see people's faces.
Yeah.
I think I've always thought that very common sort of analogy that a lot of historians like to make with the so-called American Empire and the Roman Empire in terms of our trajectories. I think it's compelling, and it's always been really eerie, the similarities. However, I lately have felt a little hesitant to think of our country as sort of this empire that is in decline and has been in decline, only because it insinuates that there is like this golden age, and there never was. So, and I think the same thing goes also, of course, for the Roman Empire too. That I think it's more the illusion of the golden age and even the illusion of a decline, because during decline, yes, there's, as Paul mentioned, there tends to be historically people pulling out the worst stops during a decline in terms of like people in power, very, you find like a lot of the most extreme tyrannical forms of authoritarianism during periods of decline, but you also have the potential of finding a lot of new radical forms of overtaking and transforming and experiments that wouldn't have happened otherwise. What's that famous phrase? Something is the necessity is the mother invention. So yeah, that's just sort of what came to mind, because that's my only issue that I have at times with thinking in such in those terms of like an empire in decline.
I'm surprised to hear you say that you don't think the US empire, other empires, that ascent is real. I mean, it's not real for everyone who lives there, but it's seems very much real for those who are the privileged in the society. No?
Well, but who's the percentage of privileged, right? So that's what I'm saying. It's like, okay, so that means that we're going to define everything in terms of those who are privileged and what they're experiencing at any given moment of time. You know what I mean? So, okay, yes, the empire is in decline, meaning that, does that mean that the average, in terms of like the average quality of life for the average person is in decline, or does that mean that people on the top are finally feeling repercussions of kind of an economic downturn, of just stress on our sort of general international globalization related stress on our economy and labor related stress? So what is that, how are we defining decline? Like who's going to be the benchmark, I guess, is my question.
Well, my thought about that is that even more is that it actually doesn't have that much to do with material wealth, right? Because it's actually like a cliche that when Rome was in its fully quote unquote decadent state, like people were the richest they had ever been, right? And then it collapsed shortly after that, right? And so it's more than having to do with the specific amounts of material wealth and power that people have access to. I think decline means that the forces of culture and meaning that hold society together are coming apart. And I think,
yeah, no, I got that.
Yeah, okay.
But I'm referring to that also. So like who are we using as a benchmark for that golden age in which culture was thriving?
Right, for the majority.
Yeah.
For the majority of Europeans, the collapse of the Roman Empire, they didn't even notice, right?
Well, like for us, okay, so what is our golden age? We've been talking about how our decline has been happening for quite a while now, right? Like how when was our peak? 50 years ago, you know, like so
70s,
okay,
maybe?
in the 70s. Okay, so in that case, who's experiencing what were the hallmarks of that golden time and who's experiencing that? You know, so we're talking about a cohesive culture, right? We're talking about a culture that's thriving and that involves people sharing principles. What the hell was happening in the 70s? You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, I guess I always think that it's a bit of an illusion when we talk about things in those terms.
I'm not thinking shared principles as much as working people saw their wages rising and their so-called quality of life rising because of it. Up until the 70s, and then everything started to crash, which is about, you know, the limits of a finite planet, which is about, you know, economic systems, other stuff. But I've shared values. No, absolutely not. But everyone's life feeling easier and better, which for most people is, you know, if you're a worker, is paying the bills and having enough money for a vacation. And so that was shared until the 70s, because economic growth was still possible to be substantial up until the 70s, until the limits to growth kicked in finally.
Right, but then that kind of is like juxtaposed with what Tyler's emphasizing, that it's not just about economic growth. And when we make the analogy between yeah, so anyway.
But is your life better or worse, right? It's like, don't the Republican one president after another is using in their campaign, you know, is your life better or worse than it was 4 years ago? And what do they mean? They mean, you know, your income, you know, your downtime, don't they? Your children have a better chance of getting a college education, maybe? Like I have money in my account to actually put my kids through college. Isn't it?
Yeah.
For almost everybody, isn't it economics ultimately?
Okay, but even if we were to look at it, I mean, I guess I would have to know more, because if we were to look at just the economic factor in the 70s, or sorry, or were you mentioning more about the 50s, like the economic boom and the baby boomers and sort of like the average income steadily rising? I'm questioning whether that was the case for Black people. You know, I mean, so.
It was.
Okay, well then maybe I'm just all wrong on all fronts, but
No.
I just no, I mean, I guess I don't know. I'm not sure that I'm kind of hesitant with anything that makes anything in the past sound like it was significantly better. Because I think that it's easy to engage in a sort of nostalgia, almost like in a mythical sense, is like what we're talking about in terms of the myth of democracy, but maybe that's just me being a little too narrow-minded about it.
It's a golden age depending on whose shoes you're in, you know. For me, politically, I still don't think the McCarthy era really hurt us terribly. Historians have said that with all the repression after World War II, the Red Scare, duck and cover, and it killed off many of our political parties that were socialist and communist. And we need all these different parties to have fertile soil for creativity. You can't have a fertile soil of a growing, you know, innovative and creative people when the soil has been sterilized and killed all the microorganisms and plant, everything in it have been stripped away in the McCarthy era. And historians say that we have not, you know, it lasted for decades and decades. We lost political parties which had different kinds of thought, which could have, you know, been contributing to preventing some of the problems that have developed. You know, I can't find a golden era. It depends on whose shoes you're in, but I sure think that, you know, having grown up in this incredible repressive Red Scare society really limited. I mean, that's why I'm so amazed today to be able to kind of break out and think in different. The first time in my life, last decade, I've been able to think in different ways. I couldn't have done that in that environment.
That was our third Red Scare, by the way. in U.S. history, which I think is worth noting. I only learned this maybe 10 years ago. I always thought of the McCarthy thing as the Red Scare, but there was an orchestrated attack on more radical activist groups, social movements, etc., 3 times, all very successful.
And so now we have no soil, you know, I mean, we're just slow today reviving a little bit of the fertile soil that was poisoned away by that extremist thinking. I mean, in Europe, they have what, you know, some countries have 12 political. I mean, you need that. You need all those different ideas. Anyway, that you know, I regret the loss.
Do we want to spend any more time on the third piece, since I don't know, are we going to end on the hour or go a little longer? Are there other things that anybody still wants to bring up from any of the pieces?
There's one question. He used the term strength through exhaustion on page, I think it's 222. And I went and looked it up. I thought that was some kind of political or a concept, and I could never get a Google. At least Google didn't give me an interpretation of what that meant.
Where is that?
On page, I think it's page 222. He talks about, which I moved my notes, so I can't find it now. Looking for it here. Anyway, maybe it was just a term he had his own definition, but I was wondering if that was a new idea, you know, that I hadn't heard of before. I guess it was his own terminology.
Yeah, and I can't find the
I
context.
see it now, Don. It's at the bottom of page 221. It's in that paragraph about unlimited economic growth, and he compares quote unquote sustainable economic growth against this strength through exhaustion, which, you know, I haven't heard that phrase before myself, but it jumps, like, it, you know, it kind of speaks to me pretty clearly of like an extractive, you know, mindset, right? Of just like, you know, we take as much as we can and we build it into power, you know, and certainly has been the paradigm that the colonial paradigm, right?
What do you all think that he means by strength through exhaustion?
I could read something into it, but I'd rather have somebody tell me. I mean, you know, I would get it wrong. But I think Tyler's I can understand what Tyler's saying. You know, strength, it's like mining an ore until the vein of the vein runs out, you know.
I think it's, you know, the way it reads to me, I think that perhaps you know, a very similar quote would be strength through exploitation, but he was directly comparing it to sustainability as this sort of longevity, kind of like, don't exhaust it all, right? That's sort of what I got from it. And with that, I think I have to get going, folks. It's 6 o'clock my time, and I got a few other things going on this evening. But it was nice chatting with you all, as always.
May I propose pages for the next week?
Please.
228 to 243. Four short essays, if that works for people. And I'll put it out, of course, in the email. Anybody else before we go on Evelina, you haven't said anything for a while. Would you like to chime in?
Great conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, likewise.
Terrific. Do we want to do a closure for anybody who's